Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with mysticgenmara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And my mouse is being weird, so I apologize for that. Just one second. There we go. Tonight on Occult and Crochet, I don't know if how much I've added to my project. It's been the last 2.5-3 weeks have been a little bit hectic, but still working on the same shawl. But I started into, get it out of the container here, the next level of the pattern. So we're getting into some little shell work there. And I'm about ready to start into the third color. So that's going to be the inside, then it fades out to this stuff. But now we're into some cool shells. And with any luck and time, I will be able to have at least to the next color, which is going to be a much more intense red, by the next episode. So we'll see how that works, if I can get everything focused. Anyhow, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Tonight on Occult and Crochet, kind of giving a break from the Wicca. There's still a lot to talk about with witchcraft and Wicca, but we've kind of covered the majority of the people from Gerald Gardner's period forward, and the people who, there's still many more, don't get me wrong. There's a lot more, but giving a little breather, just kind of stirring things up a little bit. So we're gonna hop over to some ceremonial occultists tonight. And this one in particular has some very powerful connections to the OTO, or the Ordo Templi Orientis, and distant connection to Aleister Crowley, which, when we get into this a little bit more, if it wasn't for this particular person, we probably wouldn't have as much as we do from Crowley. So I would like to introduce you to Phyllis Seckler. Not a lot of her older pictures exist. This is one of the few that I could find of her when she was younger. Many recent ones, but not too many of her older ones. But this is who we're going to be discussing tonight. And if you've never heard of her, you don't run in the right circles. Oh, if you haven't heard of her, let's find out a little bit more about her. So, Phyllis was born Phyllis Evelina Pratt in June of 1917. She was born in Edmonton, Canada, but the family would eventually move to California when Phyllis was around 4 years old. Apparently, according to the lore, her father lost a bid to be mayor in Edmonton, and because of his loss here, he ended up in an excessive level of debt. I'm not sure what that means, but that's what was alluded to. And like a lot of people, especially tied to Crowley, the Golden Dawn, and that crowd, not much else is known about her early life. I couldn't even find, as I was digging around, and it might still be out there, but there's only so much you can root through before you're like, I've read this already. I couldn't even find parents' names, so that's like, there wasn't a lot there. She would graduate from high school, though, in Los Angeles, and from there she would go on to become a stenographer. Okay, get my drink. And this training would actually help land her a bank job, which, you know, in the 40s-ish time period, the late 30s, early 40s, this was a pretty good job. Not one that I personally would chase, but it's not a bad job. And her day job, and I can relate to this because as I was reading through it, I was like, how did you take a job knowing what she does later at a bank? That sounds really boring. Well, she thought so too. Because while she was having her boring day job, it just became too monotonous for her, and she would pursue acting and drama classes in the evenings. Okay, now we're getting interesting. And It was because of these acting and drama classes that she would make her first connections to the occult. Not really a lot of spiritual before that, not even religious that I could find. So, and it would because of these drama classes and the occult connection, she would eventually meet the man that she would marry, and that's where she would achieve the last name of Seckler. I found one reference, and I forgot to write it down to his name, and then I couldn't find the website anymore. I don't know if it was just a blip in the matrix there, but that's how she ends up with the last name of Seckler. Why is my mouse being goofy? Fine, we'll do it the old-fashioned way. May need to get a new mouse because my little spinner is not wanting to work. Phyllis would attend a drama class taught by Regina Call. To be 100% honest with you, have never heard of Regina Call. I do want to kind of look into her just to see if she's worth digging further into, but she just kind of has a little flash in the pan here in this story. Regina would be the person who would introduce Phyllis to the Ordo Templi Orientis. This is where Phyllis gets into the occult in a deeper, very deep sense, actually. Regina would invite Phyllis to a public Gnostic Mass, and this particular Gnostic Mass with this particular temple was actually written by none other than Aleister Crowley for this lodge. So that's pretty impressive, to be honest with you. And Phyllis thought so too, because she was impressed by the first Gnostic Mass and would actually attend very often. Basically, whenever she had a moment or night free and they were doing something, she tried to show up. And this is where she would eventually meet actress Jane Wolfe. Jane Wolfe would become her teacher, according to most of the lore, and within the lodge. Phyllis would join the OTO in August of 1939. Jane would officially become Phyllis's teacher in June of 1940, when Phyllis became a probationer, meaning she was willing to start moving up the ranks within the OTO. But she joined not just the OTO at this point. She joined a group called the AA, not Alcoholics Anonymous, which is interesting considering the symbology here. But she would join and become a practitioner under the guidance of Jane Wolfe. And the side note that I want to toss in here, AA in this respect and throughout the rest of this thing has nothing to do with Alcoholics Anonymous. It is a lodge within the OTO, or outside of the OTO, depending on who you talk to, founded by Crowley. The AA is the training center for all things Thelema, Crowley's spiritual practice. There are a couple of different interpretations. The two that I personally find the most logical would be the Argentium Astrum, the Silver Star, or it could also be called the Arcanum Arcanorum, which is the secret of all secrets. So either one of those would be very applicable for Crowley's particular lodge of the AA. And it's interesting because when they do this, I'll type it in chat here real quick. It is an A with a... If you are watching in chat, that is the way it's written, is that symbology. And so when you see that particular way of writing it, it's, especially if you're talking about spirituality and the occult, it goes back to Crowley and Thelema. So this lodge, the Argentium Astrum or the Arcanum Arcaronum, either one, however you want to say the name, this is a major part of Crowley's legacy with Thelema, more so than pretty much any other aspect. This was his lodge. So she publicly joined the OTO, but she, I guess you could say secretly, joined the AA with Crowley and Thelema. And I'll go over a lot more of that later. I want to do it proper justice because just Thelema I'll probably end up doing a full episode on. Crowley at least 2. I want to go through a lot of him, his magic, and his legacy, so it's gonna may even be 3 parts. I haven't quite figured that all out yet. That man had an amazing life. Anyway, back to Phyllis. The lodge Phyllis would join is the Agape Lodge number 2. This particular lodge was started by Wilfred Smith in 1935. This was based in Hollywood and started with around 7 people. This lodge was known to offer the Gnostic Mass among several other events and ceremonies open to the public. So this was kind of a publicity lodge, if you want to call it that, to encourage people to come, get their feet wet, find out what it's really about, see if you want to join. And it was at one of these public events that Phyllis came to the awareness of the lodge and this new magical world, and this is what really got her into the OTO and the AA. And shortly after her initiation into the OTO, she would take on the lodge name of Soror Merrill, Sister Merrill. And this is where things get a little interesting, I would say muddled, because of who's involved over the next 5-year window, and I won't get into details on it because there's that much chaos that goes just with names and crossovers and not knowing who's exactly involved. The lodge that Phyllis joined would actually be known to some of you, especially if you've watched at least one of my previous videos, if not a couple of them. And one of the well-known members, big member in this particular lodge, before he branched out on his own, was Jack Parsons, the astrophysicist, rocket engineer, and occultist who basically blew himself up, and I've talked about him before. The other person that was in this lodge was a notorious member who actually has very nefarious roots, and from this position he did some very dirty things, and that would be L. Ron Hubbard. So this is the lodge of, like I said, things get a little chaotic here because of how history is currently written on it. I mention those 2 in particular because Phyllis, during this time, would befriend Hubbard and Wilfred Smith, the founder of the lodge. I will say that they did drift apart shortly after this bubble of time, for obvious reasons, but there was this period of time where she had interaction with some very important people in the occult world. Over a short time after joining, she would move into what they called the OTO house in Pasadena. And this was the house where they all kind of lived together before Jack and L. Ron took off to do their own things. And this house, what I would call it today, especially if you like to watch things like true crime or, that kind of stuff, especially cult crime, this would be classified as a commune, is what we would call it in today's terms. They just called it the OTO house. They were heading towards the concept of cult utopia. They would raise their own veggies and livestock. They tried to be as self-sufficient as possible, but it wasn't very long. It was less than a 5-year window that she was involved in that little bubble before she took off. Onwards and upwards for Phyllis, and that is the best thing that she could have done at this point. Phyllis would study at the University of California in Los Angeles, and from there she would graduate with honors. She was a very, very smart woman, with a master's in art. This would actually be a huge breaking point for her to get away from that, because it would give her the opportunity to move to a Northern California town. I could not find a reference for what town it was, but she would end up teaching at a high school there, and she would teach for a full 20 years and retire out. So 3 years into her new job, though, so she'd moved away, she was teaching, she was doing her thing, happy as a clam, still practicing her OTO and Thelema magic in the evenings. her teacher Jane Wolfe, who introduced her to the AA Thelema world, would pass away. Jane would will all of her papers, books, and writings to Phyllis, though. So this would have been an amazing collection of the occult because, and I'll get into Jane more later, but for this purpose, Jane had amassed a massive library of occult literature, including correspondences with different occult teachers and some of the secret inner journals that only the initiates would have had, especially higher up initiates. So all of this now has landed in Phyllis's lap, which is amazing. As Phyllis taught in her day job, she would devote her spare time to all practices of Thelema and the OTO. She would work through degrees of the lodge under one of Jane's friends' tutelage, which would be Carl Germer, and I will go further into him later. And he was living in New Jersey, but he would correspond via letter to Phyllis through this whole time period. Interestingly enough, there is some controversy as to whether or not Phyllis achieved degrees within the OTO or if it was just within the Thelema AA. And the reason that is there's some people who believe that Germer conferred all these different titles and positions and degrees upon her, but then there's others within the lodge itself, the OTO lodge, who said that didn't happen and she only achieved like 1 or 2 ranks. She, in what I could find of her writings, I'd love to read her work. I've only read a little bit of it, so like I said, that's my bad. But I couldn't find a good biography of her either, so that didn't help. But from what I could find is she didn't talk about achieving these high level of degrees. That wasn't her thing. Her thing was the magic and the beauty of Thelema, and if you study into and look into Crowley's concept and belief around what the AA was supposed to be, it wasn't meant to focus on degrees. So I think that's where she kind of took that and ran with it, because she was a powerful person in her own right, but she didn't have all the fancy titles to go with it, which is, like I said, I don't care about that. But there was a little bit of controversy I ran across with that section. At the time of Crowley's passing, in 1947, Phyllis had been a member in good standing of the Agape Lodge in SoCal. And did I mention at this time that it was the only functioning OTO lodge in North America, possibly worldwide, and all the others were barely functioning or completely defunct and not even open anymore for any form of practice, rite, or etc. So it was literally down to like her lodge that she joined years before. Carl Germer was appointed to be Crowley's successor in the OTO as head of the order. Carl wanted to collect and copy, after Crowley's passing, all of Crowley's work. And he had started to collect and work on this project. It was huge. And at one point, it was said that there was over 3 tons, 6,000 pounds. I'm not even sure how they shipped this, but they actually specified a weight of work from Crowley's homes in Britain and England, sent to Germer in New Jersey. Letters, articles, images, tools, robes, altars, paperwork, all of it. I could not even imagine being in the room with even a quarter of that work that Crowley had written or created. But to get all of that brought to you, huge. Or I just lost my place. Phyllis was concerned about the passing of Crowley, because when Crowley passed, it rippled through the occult community. Like, it was very well discussed and talked about, shocked everybody really too. She feared that this amazing man's writings and teachings would be lost. So she brought these concerns to Carl, because Carl had amassed a massive, she knew of anyway, record of his work. And Carl explained that because he was now the head of the order, he was receiving all of Crowley's work and needed some help with the copies. And he offered Phyllis a position in the saving of Crowley's work. Phyllis jumped at this chance. She used her skills as a stenographer and went straight to work. She typed many of the longer manuscripts from handwritten, scribbled notes into fully functional, readable works. With her eye for detail and her artistic mind, she caught the little slips in the writing and the images. Sometimes it'd be a spelling error in some of that stuff, which if you've ever tried to read cursive when you're in a hurry, I get that. But she was able to understand the images and what was being described in those images and really bring that forward, which is huge in my mind. Correcting these little twists and turns, getting them back in line with the actual full teachings of what Crowley had been trying to work with there. And she did this with massive chunks of literature. Carl was very excited with Phyllis's hard work, and actually, as a thank you, gifted her some of the rarer original texts. Hello, from Crowley, which I could not even begin to think of how precious those would be to someone in her position. Like, that's pretty cool to actually have the handwritten work from someone like Crowley. In 1954, Carl retired. What did just happen? My mouse is really starting to get on my nerves. Carl retired and moved to California, and here he would find a permanent home for the headquarters of the OTO, because prior to that it was kind of floating around wherever Crowley or whoever was in charge happened to be living. He tried to Carl tried to establish a full functioning headquarters and lodge in California. He eventually landed in West Point, California, and here he would pursue finding a publisher for the rest of Crowley's work. I have to just point this out. Carl Germer and Phyllis Seckler in particular wanted to take everything that Crowley had ever written, all of it, which we know now how many volumes that could actually be, like World Encyclopedia levels, if not Britannica levels of information that man had wrote, and they wanted it all to be published. That was not something a publisher, especially in the 50s and 60s, was even considering. They thought you were insane. So they would get little bits and pieces published here and there, but not the full works, because no one wanted to touch that. Today, it's out there. A significant portion of it is out there. Still not everything, but they are still getting it out. Not these two, but people who follow Crowley are still trying to get this information out. The downside of Carl's dream was not to be, though. This just wasn't going to work for Carl, not in his lifetime. Carl would eventually pass away in 1962. And this is not an episode for Carl, but he plays such an important role during this time period, and the Germer family plays such an important role here. There's going to be a lot of crossover with Phyllis. After his passing, his will stated that... Where did you guys go? There it is. All of his work should go to the hereditary heads of the OTO. Carl's partner, wife, however you want to see her, Sasha, and a Swiss OTO members were the two most fitting for that position, and they were also the oldest, longest standing members of the OTO at that time. And, whoops, where is it? There it is. This is a picture of Phyllis in the middle. This is Carl, and this one over here is Sasha. So Sasha and Carl are the Germers, and they were the ones that taken care of all of Crowley's stuff, and Phyllis was a very close friend of this family up until Carl's death, and that's where we're going next. Carl's widow would inform Phyllis. Actually, she told Phyllis this is how close they were before anyone else in the lodge outside of a few of the doctors about Carl's passing. This is how close they were. The Swiss OTO head was named Frederick Mellinger, and he lived outside of the United States. They didn't specify if he lived in Sweden or if he just lived in Europe somewhere. But a letter chain was established with Frederick, and he would eventually be told, you and Sasha are the two that are in charge of the OTO now. Do you want to come to California so we can sort this stuff out? Frederick was not interested, pretty much told him, you do what you need to do, I'm not coming over. And this was very frustrating to Sasha because she wanted to find a safe place for all of Crowley's work, especially being a widowed woman in that time period. It wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't exactly the safest thing either, especially with the type of stuff that she had. And now we reintroduce Phyllis to all of this mess. Frederick would pass away without resolving the situation. Back and forth with letters, just no, he was not coming to the States, period. And after he passed, all of this inheritance fell to Carl's widow, Sasha, and by extension, Phyllis, because she was the active leading person in the OTO at the time. Phyllis would go to her higher guidance, ritual work, meditation, and activate the higher planes, seeking advice for what to do with all of the advice, or seeking advice to do what to do with all of Crowley's work. And the advice that she was given was to not allow Carl's death to be revealed. This was all within a short period of time. And to keep things very quiet until they could get everything out of Southern California. Her guidance told her to get everything, including Sasha, out of SoCal. This confirmed what Phyllis was kind of feeling, that there was something not quite right going on down in Southern California at the time. And, you know, no big deal. Everything's good. Happy endings. Yeah, no. With 90% of the stories, especially around certain branches of the occult, that this was a lead-in to the darker times. Carl's passing had leaked out in 1967. And there were some scheming people. I'm really not impressed with this group because they are vile in my mind. Showed up at Carl's widow's house. You saw the picture. Carl's widow, Sasha, was not a young woman at this time. And they lied to her to get her to open the door. They claimed that they were part of the OTO from the East Coast, and they were just wanting to do some research in Crowley's library. And so she eventually would open her door and let them come in to research. They would assault her. They would spray a paralyzing gas, I'm assuming chloroform, because she was an older lady, and knock her unconscious. The thieves would steal several very valuable manuscripts from the texts out of the library. Sasha would eventually wake up, and she filed a full police report on the theft. And the same year, because this was in the springtime and around midsummer, Phyllis would end up being informed of this theft. And some parties, Sasha was one that kind of semi-cast a shadow towards Phyllis, and they would not accuse Phyllis directly, but her child, Phyllis's daughter, would be accused of theft. And I don't know why they would accuse her of the theft. People need to find hobbies. Phyllis was there helping translate and transcribe all of this work. She had 100% access to it at any point in time. Why would she steal from something she had full access to? It made no sense. But sorry, I get frustrated with that because every time I'd read through it, I'm like, what is going on here? Anyway, Phyllis 100% was not feeling too frustrated with Sasha. She was, frustrated, but not like gonna end a friendship over it. So she knew it was a lie, and she also knew that she didn't do it. And eventually, it was confirmed. Courts came out. It was not Phyllis, and Phyllis was just as mad as Sasha about the theft. So she did what an intelligent woman would do. She started doing her own digging. Phyllis contacted many people in the lodge and outside of the lodge that she had met over the years, and found one of her friends had been the victim of a theft. And then she found out that Israel Regardi had been a victim of theft as well. And during this search for the OTO contacts, she actually started to communicate with a man named Grady McMurdy, who I've talked about earlier, and he worked with Carl Germer, and they had a little bit of a falling out over some minor stuff, and Grady was back in Washington, D.C. at the time. It would eventually be found out over all of this back and forth with letters and some phone calls, and because phones weren't super common, they were getting to be, but not everyone had them yet. And with all the chaos, it would eventually be found out that there was a small occult lodge that was responsible for every single theft of OTO, Golden Dawn, or Crowley-related paperwork. This lodge was called the Solar Lodge, and it was supposedly an OTO lodge, but it would not initiate another person after 1972. Just a side note. They claimed they were not an official OTO lodge. That is one thing I will point out right now. They were not an official OTO lodge. They had no chain going back to Crowley or anyone else that I could find. They claimed that they were following Aleister Crowley's teachings, and I question that from what I was finding as I researched Phyllis's work. Most of the works would eventually be recovered, and the group would get mired in court proceedings for years. Eventually, the FBI would actually shut them down, and I want to do more interest into this group, because I didn't get too much into it. I was looking mainly at what Phyllis's role was, but to be shut down by the FBI for some stealing and who knows what else, they are worth a double check, because I do want to find out what all they were up to, because you don't get the FBI involved over some theft. You do over other things. That's the reason I'm curious. Anyway, Sasha would pass away in 1975. And I don't know how to feel about this part. Phyllis wasn't told about Sasha's passing until a year later. How do you go from being so close with somebody to not knowing that they died? So confused by that. Phyllis was the current spiritual heir of the OTO. She was the oldest person who'd been there. She'd been trained and worked with literally the top people at that time's death, and Phyllis laying claim to the library because she would, being the head of the OTO at the time, be able to lay claim to that. This house where Sasha had lived and the library was housed had been vandalized and broken into several times. In that year, it was said it had been broken into or invaded, depending on which article you read, over 3 times, and the damage was substantial. The authorities claimed it was too hard to properly lock up this estate. It's called a padlock and some nails. Anyway, eventually in the summer of 1976, though, all the rights to the estate were transferred to the OTO and by extension to Phyllis Seckler. She would gain full access to everything, which is good, because that's ridiculous that it was left like that. The Crowley work had finally come home, back to its spiritual home. It was back in the possession of someone who truly was devoted to the OTO and to the AA under the Thelema Lodge, and this would signal and trigger the rebirth of the full OTO. As I stated earlier, Phyllis had begun a communication with Grady McMurdy. Grady, when he left Carl, had been granted emergency powers to take over the OTO if it was ever left leaderless. Crowley was an exceptionally intelligent man, whether it was from his own knowledge or from spiritual knowledge, but he had been suspicious that Carl, in his kind of egoic state, would not name a successor in a clear or straightforward way. Which, why wouldn't you? Again, there are people in this era that make no sense to me. And Crowley was right. Crowley was right about a lot of things over the years. Carl never named a successor, as I said earlier, but Grady had full documentation that he was to be the successor if it was ever left empty. And Grady showed Phyllis these letters and the full authorization and support of Crowley for the emergency takeover if this occurrence had ever happened. Phyllis saw this as the opportunity she needed to save her beloved OTO and by extension expand the Thelema AA practices. Grady accepted the title of Caliph, and the name he chose to go forward with was Frater Hymenius Alpha, and it was with that title he invoked all emergency powers as set forth by Crowley. And as I said with Grady's one, I couldn't find a full list of what those authorities were, but it basically said that he had final say in the lodge. The OTO at this time had been lagging severely, almost to the point of disappearing. Even with all of Phyllis's hard work, support, trying to gain attention, getting it moving again, it was just falling apart. Germer and Sasha, or Carl and Sasha, by the end, didn't have the heart. I mean, they were in their 80s, I believe. What'd you expect them to do? Go out there and tap dance and bring people in? Like, there comes a point type of a thing. And that's where Carl should have handed it off, but he didn't. But this new energy, having Grady stepping into the leadership for years, having someone direct line to the founder of the Thelema AA and the rebirth of the OTO under that previous founder, was it led to the revitalization of this lodge, and because of this and the massive growth that occurred thereafter, it was fully incorporated as a spiritual group under the California law. So this proved their legitimacy at this point. Excellent flavor, by the way. Elderberry juniper. The OTO began to grow, and it grew massively under the very careful and skilled guidance of Grady McMurdy and Phyllis Seckler. Phyllis used her lodge name as her primary pen name, so Soror Merrill, and she would remain master of the 418 Lodge of the OTO in California from its reestablishment in 1979 until her passing, or so it is said. I did find one spot that said she handed over full authority of leadership 2 months before she passed. It's almost like she knew she was going to go, and so she bequeathed the mantle to the next head. And he's still alive and doing his thing, which is amazing. Oh, and on that, I put links in the description of this video. You can check those out. One is to the OTO, the other one is to the College of Thelema, and I'll explain that in a second. But those are two links that are down there in the description. If you ever want to get a little more information about those two groups, or are curious about maybe finding something close to you, because they do a lot of public stuff as well, so you can try before you buy type of a thing. You can check those links out and see what you think. That being said, one of Phyllis's big legacies, in my opinion, and she had a couple. We're going to bounce through some of her legacy right quick. She established what she called the College of Thelema, linked below. And it's not an affiliated link, it's just giving you the information if you're looking for it. This king, these two groups were set up with a specific focus and goal. Both were set up with curriculum written and created by Phyllis. They were built with the intention of making it easier for new students to understand and grow within the lodge. They have similar goals, different methods of doing so. And I've looked at various works of the AA. I have the official, and I believe it's actually from one of these groups, text, which I should have brought down. It's huge. It's 18 by 16 inches, like an inch and a half thick text of what it would take starting on day one with no knowledge, going to the end where you have actually achieved mastery of the AA work. It is an exceptionally complicated spiritual journey. The text that one of the texts that to complete that, you need Israel Regardi was one of them, and Phyllis Seckler was the other one that kind of set the stuff up. Wiser Publication are the other ones. But with those, you actually have a working knowledge of what Crowley was trying to inspire in people. It wasn't just, but this is the type of stuff that Phyllis wanted you to learn. It wasn't about, oh, I need to gain titles and all of this. It was a spiritual work, but complicated, but it was still something that needed, in her mind, to be spread. The College of Thelema and the Temple of Thelema are not something to be entered into lightly. These are resources that they created that became invaluable to the growth of the soul. What Crowley established was great, but Crowley's mind thought, 900 miles above most people. So the College of Thelema and the Temple of Thelema were established to break it down into something that you were easier to understand. Not everyone's going to have the background that Crowley had when he got the inspiration for this. So this is what those two were established for. Another part of Phyllis's amazing legacy is her newsletter. It was called In the Continuum, and it was in continuous publication, I believe 2 if not 3 times a year. It wasn't heavy, it was just a couple times a year, from 1976 to 1996. This is where she would explain the works of Thelema, what it meant to be in Thelema, how to practice stuff, what the meditations could be, the symbologies. She broke down the exercises, enhanced the illustrations that Crowley and others had done, and made it so that it was accessible to the members. And this was a newsletter only for members in good standing of the OTO. This letter would also publish some more of the more obscure works of Crowley, keeping them from being lost to the sands of time. Interesting side note. And when I was researching her, I'm like, okay, really good at what she's doing. She's getting the word out. She's kind of explaining what Thelema is, helping people understand what the OTO stands for. She's doing a lot of cool stuff. There's something that's got to make her stand out. Kind of like Pamela Pixie, Coleman Smith. There are things about these people that trigger, like, there it is. That's the thing that it's kind of an eye catcher. And this is what I found that I thought was just fascinating. Phyllis would follow in Crowley's footsteps in more ways than not, and in ways people today would probably not understand. She was an outspoken women's rights activist back in the day. Just equal rights, not extra, just equal. Put us on same pay, same rights, want to work, whatever. And girl, she went out of her way to help others discover the beauty and spiritual power, really, of Thelema. Some of those, after Crowley kind of stepped away from active control of a lot of these things, only wanted the wealthy or the affluent people, or those who had the right bloodlines of, mysticism, to have access to what Crowley had taught. That's not what Crowley did, and that's not what Phyllis did. She wanted people to have access to this knowledge. So she helped people who were sincere in their hunger for spiritual knowledge. Sounds kind of like someone else who did that. Crowley did that. This was the downtrodden woman. Have to be careful where I'm at, the grape survivor. The outcast gay man. This is the people that she reached out to if you had a sincere hunger for knowledge. She had the ability to discern, so did Crowley, if you were actually hungering for knowledge and spiritual awareness, or if you were hungering for power. If it was power, there's another group you can go join. Let me introduce you to them. But that wasn't what she was doing. She wanted them to understand, if you're doing this, do it for the right reasons. This is what I have to offer. This is what we teach. She would encourage these people as well to write articles that she would publish in her newsletter, and that actually helped support people and get them back on their feet. She also had them illustrate stuff when she was needing an illustration for a story or for a description of she had a description of something, but she needed an illustration for it. She would hire these people to do that. She wanted knowledge expanding. She wanted spiritual awakening to occur. She was a little bit more gentle than Crowley, because Crowley could be pretty crass at times. But it was because if you're not willing to break social norms, what are you doing? And that was kind of his way of doing it. That didn't mean to go against natural norms. Social norms and natural norms are different. Hugely different. And like I said, I want to give Crowley the proper go-over, because he's an amazing person. I can see why they call him the wickedest man alive, but he's also pretty cool. Crowley would teach anyone who had a sincere hunger for knowledge and spiritual power and awakening. He did not teach people who had ego power, L. Ron Hubbard, or for power over others, Hubbard. But he did make some mistakes along the way. He taught some people maybe he shouldn't have, and he realized it after the fact. But that's why he got to the point where he would do what he did. Some of the people that he regretted, I would say, I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming he would regret, are people like Jack Parsons, because he fell in with that writer of science fiction and gave him information he shouldn't have. Those type of people Crowley was not okay with. Crowley ignored, would throw away letters, would deny meetings, because he knew if a person was sincere or not, and if they weren't sincere in a spiritual desire, they were out. Phyllis was the same. Not as harsh, but the same. Phyllis followed the heart of that teachings of Crowley's. Even though she had never physically met Crowley, they lived in a time frame that crossed over, but she had never physically met the man. And from what I could find, she never had correspondence with him, which is kind of strange. But I think that she had studied, written, and researched so much of his writings, his journals and letters, that she came to know him in a way most of us today would never have comprehension of. She was able to see, and as the head of the OTO and the spiritual heir of that, she had access to all of his work. And I think that she came to understand him in a way that we never will. Just putting that out there. Phyllis would leave this world and enter the Brotherhood and Sisterhood of the Light in the spring of 2004. She left behind a legacy of humility, of support for looking after the downtrodden, and a hunger for spiritual knowledge. Her work is still in publication today. There's 3 books that I linked in the description. They're kind of selected works. They're condensed volumes. But you can check out the OTO and the College of Thelema. They have sections of her writings. There's essays. There's the newsletters. And the Temple of Thelema, I believe it is, actually continued on a newsletter in her honor. And so you can go find that as well. She had an amazing life. Kind of boring to start off with. I mean, bank teller, like, woo. But over the years, she had made a name for herself within the occult community. She revived and saved an entire line of Crowley's work. Actually, the majority of it, if we're going to be honest. And she was able to get a lot of that put back into the hands of the people who actually wanted to learn. Fascinating woman, amazing from what I found person, and I've ran across her name a lot. I just never thought to actually put her into this position. She has a lot of stuff out there. She has a lot of knowledge out there. So if you are interested in expanding, coming to a different terms of things, check her out. Check out the OTO. With caution, I'm not going to say good, bad, or indifferent. The OTO has an interesting legacy, so check it out, look into it, see if it's something you're interested in, but do so with your eyes open. That's the one thing that I have taken away from Phyllis. It's one thing I have learned from Crowley and several others. Don't walk blindly and do not follow blindly any spiritual leader. Do your research, figure it out for yourself, find a path that's right for you. With that, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a like on the video, comment and let me know if if the OTO is something you've ran across, if Phyllis Seckler is someone that you ever met, because let's be honest, 2004 wasn't that long ago. For those of you using year dates, don't do that. But I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. I will see you in the next video. Have a great rest of your evening.